The sound cut through the hushed atmosphere of Maison Lenox like shattered glass. "Get that crying baby out of here. This is not a damn daycare." Every head in the upscale restaurant turned. Forks hovered mid-air. The smooth jazz playing in the background suddenly felt like a cruel joke. At the center of the storm was a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets, yet now sat utterly paralyzed. Richard Sterling, a tech titan whose name regularly graced financial headlines, held his 11-month-old son, Theo, who was screaming with a raw, gut-wrenching intensity. The baby's face was red, his tiny fists clenched, crying as if his heart was breaking. Richard's usual composure was gone. Beads of sweat formed at his temple. He tried everything, a pacifier, a bottle, a soft toy. His assistant, Karen, fumbled with her phone, playing gentle lullabies under the table. Nothing worked. The elegant diners around them shifted uncomfortably. Some sighed loudly. A couple requested to be moved to the patio, despite the chilly evening air. Richard felt the weight of 100 silent judgments. In that moment, his billions were worthless. He was just a father, failing his son in public. Just as the manager began to nervously approach, a young woman emerged from the direction of the kitchens. She moved with a quiet certainty, her white sneakers silent on the polished floor. Her name tag read Amara. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her expression calm amidst the chaos. She didn't look at the manager, who was mouthing words about protocol. Instead, her eyes met Richard's. In them, he didn't see pity or judgment, just a steady, offered calm. "Let me try," she said, her voice soft but clear. Richard, out of options and stripped of pride, gave a slight, desperate nod. Amara knelt beside the highchair. She didn't reach for Theo immediately. She just smiled gently, her presence open and patient. Then, she extended her arms. To everyone's astonishment, the screaming baby leaned toward her. She gathered him up, settling him against her shoulder with a natural ease. She began to sway gently, a slow, rhythmic motion, and hummed a tune so low it was almost a vibration. Within seconds, Theo's cries subsided into shaky hiccups. Then, silence. A deep, peaceful silence that felt heavier than the noise that had preceded it. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale. Amara simply stood there, holding the now sleeping child, her focus entirely on him. She didn't look at the stunned guests. She didn't seek approval. In a room full of wealth and influence, the most powerful act was this simple, human kindness. That moment was no accident. Amara Johnson wasn't even supposed to be on the floor that night. She had swapped shifts last minute to cover for a friend, needing the extra hours to help pay the electricity bill in the Brooklyn walk-up she shared with 2 roommates. At 23, she balanced psychology classes at NYU with night serving at Maison Lenox. The restaurant was a world of polished silver and whispered deals, a place where the staff rarely looked like her. She was accustomed to the subtle slights. The customers who looked past her, the ones who spoke slowly as if she wouldn't understand, the comments veiled as compliments about her surprising efficiency. Earlier that very evening, she had been serving a table of loudly confident men. As she bent to retrieve a fallen napkin, one of them, a man with silver hair and a cold smile, had muttered just loud enough for his friends to hear, "Standards are really changing, aren't they? Must be one of those quota hires." A ripple of tense laughter followed. Amara had straightened up, her spine rigid, met his gaze, and asked with perfect, icy politeness, "More bread, sir?" She had walked away, the heat of humiliation burning her cheeks, and taken a moment in the staff bathroom to steady her breathing, staring at her reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. She didn't cry often, but sometimes the constant abrasion wore her down. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You walk with your own dignity, child. Don't let anyone take your steps from you." She fixed her apron, smoothed her hair, and walked back out. She carried her dignity with her, a silent shield. And not 10 minutes later, she heard Theo cry. It wasn't a normal fussy cry. Amara recognized it instantly, a cry of profound distress, the kind that speaks of a pain too big for words. It was the same sound she had heard countless times years ago, during the summers she volunteered at a camp for grieving children. She had learned to hold space for that kind of pain, to be an anchor in someone else's storm. So when she saw the powerful man crumbling under the weight of his son's sorrow, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a parent drowning. And she stepped forward. The silence in the wake of Theo's calm was profound, but it was quickly filled by a low buzz of reaction. Some diners looked on with soft, touched expressions. Others exchanged glances that were harder to read. At the table where the silver-haired man sat, he took a sip of his whiskey and said with a dismissive chuckle, "Some people just have the touch, I guess. Probably used to it." His companions offered weak, agreeing smiles. Amara heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the warm, steady weight of the baby against her shoulder, the gradual slowing of his breath. She gently rubbed his back in small circles. Richard Sterling watched her, a storm of emotions in his eyes, relief, shame, and a dawning, profound gratitude. When he finally found his voice, it was rough. "Thank you," he said, standing and approaching her cautiously, as if afraid to break the spell. Amara turned slightly, offering a small, professional smile. He was just overwhelmed. "It happens. His mother passed away. 3 months ago," Richard found himself confessing, the words leaving him in a rush he hadn't intended. "It's been hard. For him. For me." Amara's eyes softened, holding an understanding that felt deeper than sympathy. "I'm very sorry," she said simply. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule. How did you?" He gestured vaguely, at a loss. "I just held him," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Sometimes, that's all they need to know. That someone's there, and they won't leave when it gets loud. The sentence landed in Richard's chest with the weight of truth. He looked at his son, now peacefully asleep, clinging to the fabric of Amara's uniform. He looked at the young woman who, in 5 minutes, had done what he had failed to do for months, bring his son peace. In that moment, a wall built of status, wealth, and isolation began to crack. Not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet, undeniable sound of one human being genuinely seeing another. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Richard. He paid the bill, left a tip so large it made the manager's eyes widen, and carefully took Theo back from Amara. The baby whimpered slightly in his sleep, his small hand briefly clutching at her sleeve before letting go. Richard didn't leave immediately. He waited near the entrance as the restaurant emptied, watching Amara clear tables with the same efficient, graceful calm she had shown with his son. When she finally finished and headed toward the staff area, he stopped her. "Amara," he said, reading her name tag. "That's a beautiful name." "It means grace," she said, almost to herself. He nodded slowly. "It suits you." He hesitated, the CEO who made billion-dollar decisions without blinking, now uncertain. "What you did tonight, it wasn't nothing. It was everything." Amara met his gaze, her own tired but clear. "I was just doing what felt right." "Right," Richard echoed. He took a deep breath, a decision forming in the quiet between them. "Would you consider letting me thank you properly? Maybe we could talk tomorrow." Amara studied him for a long moment, not seeing a wallet or a title, but the exhausted, grieving man beneath it. She saw the hope, fragile and tentative, in his eyes. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay, we can talk." She gave him a number for the restaurant's front desk, a neutral ground. As she walked away, Richard Sterling stood in the opulent, emptying restaurant, his sleeping son in his arms, and felt, for the first time in months, that the unbearable weight might just have become a fraction lighter. The morning after the incident at Maison Lenox, dawn broke over Manhattan in pale gold streaks. In his penthouse high above Central Park, Richard Sterling was already awake. He hadn't slept much. Theo had woken twice, restless, his cries tinged with the same panicked despair from the restaurant. Richard had tried to mimic the gentle sway, the low hum, but his movements felt stiff, his voice hollow. The memory of Amara's calm was a ghost in the room, showing him everything he lacked. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city stir. The silence in the vast, minimalist apartment was oppressive. It was a space designed for entertaining moguls and hosting galas, not for comforting a grieving baby. Everything was steel, glass, and imported marble, beautiful, cold, and echoing with absence. He thought of his wife, Elena. Her laughter used to bounce off these very walls. Now, only Theo's cries seemed to live here. 3 months. It felt like 3 years and 3 seconds all at once. The corporate titan, the visionary, the media fawned over, felt like a fraud in his own home. He could build an empire but couldn't soothe his own son. With a resolve born of desperation, he picked up his phone. He called the restaurant. The manager, Troy, answered with practiced smoothness. Maison Lennox, how may I assist you? This is Richard Sterling. I need to speak with Amara. The waitress from last night. There was a palpable pause on the line. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, we don't typically give out employee contact information. I'd be happy to pass along a message. Richard's voice, usually so controlled, tightened. I'm not asking for her number. I'm informing you that I intend to offer her a position. A full-time position as a caregiver for my son. Another, longer silence. He could almost hear Troy's mental calculations. Sir, with all due respect, Amara is a valued member of our service team. We've invested in her training. She's part of our diversity outreach program. The words felt insulting, reducing Amara to a checkbox. Richard's tone turned to ice. Last night, you tried to stop her from helping me because she wasn't on that table. She was the only person in that entire room who saw my son as a human being in pain, not as an inconvenience. That isn't something you train for, Troy. That's character. Please have her call me at this number when her shift ends. He recited his private line and hung up before the manager could form another objection. Across the river in Brooklyn, Amara was already on the subway, heading to her morning class. She replayed the previous night in her mind, the baby's weight against her, the sudden silence, the raw gratitude in Richard Sterling's eyes. It felt surreal. In her world, men like him were abstractions, faces on magazine covers, not people who looked at you with helpless relief. She also remembered the silver-haired man's sneer, the manager's nervous hesitation. Some things never changed. The brief moment of connection felt like a small island in a vast, choppy sea of everyday microaggressions. After her last lecture, her phone buzzed with a message from the restaurant's landline number. It was Troy, his voice strained with forced politeness, relaying Mr. Sterling's message and phone number. Amara stared at the digits on her screen. A job offer. Nannying. It was a world away from waitressing and psychology textbooks. Her immediate instinct was caution. The lives of the ultra-wealthy were gilded cages, and she had no interest in being someone's hired help in a different setting. But then she thought of Theo's cry, that specific, heartbreaking sound of loss she recognized all too well. She thought of the way he had melted against her, as if he'd found a port in his storm. That evening, she called the number from a park bench, the sounds of Brooklyn kids playing basketball in the background. Richard Sterling. His voice was brisk, professional. Mr. Sterling, it's Amara. From the restaurant. The change in his tone was immediate. It softened, lost its boardroom edge. Amara. Thank you for calling. He didn't waste time. The offer is genuine. Full-time. Salary, benefits, healthcare. Your own suite here if you prefer. Your main focus would be Theo. I saw what you did. He hasn't slept that peacefully since his mother died. Amara listened, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling. But I'm not a professional nanny. I'm a student. I wait tables. What you are, he said, sincerity cutting through the line, is the person my son trusts. I'm not hiring a resume. I'm asking for help from the one person who actually helped. He paused. We could arrange your schedule around your classes. Consider it, a specialized internship in applied child psychology. It was a generous, almost awkward attempt to bridge their worlds. Amara smiled faintly. Can I think about it? Of course. Take your time. Another pause. He smiled today. Just once. After last night. I thought you should know. That did it. The image of that sad little boy finding a moment of happiness was more persuasive than any salary figure. She thought of her mother, who would have moved mountains to comfort a child. She thought of her own mounting bills. "Okay," Amara said, the word leaving her lips before she could overthink it. "I'll give it a trial period." For Theo. A week later, Amara stood outside the gleaming tower on Central Park West, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, her same reliable sneakers. The doorman, in a uniform more expensive than her entire wardrobe, gave her a politely skeptical once-over before calling up. The penthouse elevator opened directly into the foyer. It was as stunning and impersonal as she'd imagined, a museum of modern design. And then, a warm, chaotic contrast, Theo sat on the pristine rug, surrounded by colorful blocks, babbling to himself. When he saw her, his eyes widened. He didn't cry. He simply raised his arms towards her, a silent, profound request. Richard stood nearby, watching the interaction. He looked less haunted today, though shadows still lingered under his eyes. "He remembers you," he said, a note of awe in his voice. Amara dropped her bag and went straight to Theo, scooping him up. He immediately buried his face in her neck. "Hey, little man," she whispered. "We're gonna be friends, okay?" The first few days were a dance of adjustment. Amara learned Theo's rhythms, his feeding times, the toys that distracted him, the specific way he liked to be rocked. She brought small, simple changes. A soft, colorful blanket from home draped over the stark white sofa, children's books from the library scattered on the glass coffee table, the gentle sound of soul music playing low in the background instead of total silence. Richard observed it all. At first, he was a ghost in his own home, appearing briefly between meetings, awkward and unsure of his place in this new dynamic. He'd ask logistical questions: did he eat? Is his diaper okay? But slowly, driven by a mix of curiosity and a deep-seated need to connect, he began to ask different questions. "Why do you hold him like that?" he asked one afternoon, watching Amara cradle Theo sideways against her chest, her hand supporting his head. "It's called a colic hold," she explained, shifting Theo gently. "It puts gentle pressure on the belly. Sometimes when they're that upset, it's not just emotion. There's a physical discomfort, too. This can help." Richard nodded, filing the information away like crucial market data. Another day, he found Amara sitting on the floor with Theo, not playing with him, but just being with him as he quietly stacked rings. "You're not always trying to teach him something," Richard noted, leaning against the doorway. "Not everything needs to be a lesson," Amara said softly, not looking up. "Sometimes he just needs to feel safe enough to be bored. To exist without performance." The sentence hit Richard with unexpected force. To exist without performance. How long had it been since he had allowed himself that? His whole life was a performance, the confident CEO, the grieving widower, the competent single father. He realized, with a jolt, that Amara was creating a space not just for Theo, but inadvertently, for him as well, a space where failure was allowed, where silence wasn't awkward, where grief could just be without needing a solution. One rainy Thursday, Theo was napping. Amara was at the kitchen island, reviewing her psychology notes. Richard poured 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, not the espresso he usually gulped down, and slid one toward her. "Can I ask you something?" he began, his voice uncharacteristically tentative. "That night, you knew what to do immediately. It wasn't just intuition, was it?" Amara closed her textbook. She looked out at the rain-smeared skyline. "My mother was a hospice nurse," she said finally. "And she babysat for everyone in our building. A lot of the kids came from hard situations. Broken homes, loss. I was her little assistant." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I learned that some cries aren't for food or a wet diaper. They're for a loss so big a baby can't understand it. All you can do is hold the space. Be the steady thing in the earthquake." "She sounds like an amazing woman," Richard said quietly. She was. Amara took a slow breath. "She died last year. In the ER. They took too long. They saw her zip code before they saw her pain. The raw, unfiltered truth of it hung in the air. Richard, who was used to solving problems with money and influence, felt utterly helpless. "Amara, I'm so sorry." She shrugged, a gesture of resilient acceptance. "I carry her with me. In how I hold Theo. In how I breathe. She taught me that." She looked at him then, her eyes clear. "Theo isn't just crying for his mother. He's crying for the world he lost. You can't bring it back. But you can show him the world is still safe. One steady moment at a time." Richard stared into his coffee, her words sinking in. For months, he'd been trying to fix Theo's grief, to make it stop. Amara wasn't trying to fix it. She was teaching him, and by extension Richard, how to live alongside it. In that quiet, rain-filled afternoon, in a penthouse that had felt like a tomb, something began, very slowly, to thaw. It wasn't a grand romance. It was something more foundational, the fragile, tentative beginnings of trust, built on a shared, unspoken understanding of what it means to survive profound loss. The billionaire and the student were no longer employer and employee in that moment. They were just two people, in a quiet room, learning how to breathe again. The trust that began as a fragile seed in the rainy afternoon took root. It didn't grow with dramatic declarations, but with quiet, daily acts. Amara's presence became the new architecture of the penthouse, one built on patience instead of pretense. Richard started coming home earlier. Not every day, but more often. He'd find Amara on the floor with Theo, not just caring for him, but engaging with him. She'd narrate their day in a soft voice as she fed him, describing the clouds passing the window as fluffy ships or the elevator ding as the going up bird. She turned routine into ritual, and in doing so, made the world feel predictable and safe for a boy whose world had shattered unpredictably. One evening, Richard stood frozen in the doorway of the nursery, watching Amara handle a scenario he'd failed at repeatedly, Theo's bedtime meltdown. The baby was exhausted, rubbing his eyes and wailing, fighting sleep as if it were an enemy. Richard's instinct was to rock harder, to shush louder, to fix the noise. Amara did the opposite. She stopped rocking. She sat in the glider, settled Theo against her chest, and went utterly still. She matched his tense little body with her own complete calm. She didn't speak. She just breathed, deep and slow, her hand a steady weight on his back. She became an anchor, and slowly, Theo's frantic waves against her began to still, his cries dissolving into hiccups, then into the deep, even breaths of sleep. "How did you do that?" Richard whispered later, genuinely mystified. "You can't outshout the storm," Amara said simply, washing a bottle in the sink. "You have to become the calm inside it. He needs to feel that the calm exists, that he can find it. He can't find it if you're storming too." It was a lesson in emotional physics. Richard, a man who solved problems by exerting more force, was learning the power of grounded stillness. He began to ask for tutorials. "Show me how you hold him for his bottle. What does that song mean?" Amara showed him, her instructions practical and free of judgment. The first time Richard successfully put Theo to sleep using her method, slow breathing, quiet presence, he emerged from the nursery with a look of stunned triumph. It was a victory more satisfying than any quarterly earnings report. Conversations evolved beyond Theo. During nap times, over coffee, they talked. Richard spoke of Elena, not in the past tense eulogies he gave at public memorials, but in present tense absences, the scent of her perfume he still caught sometimes, the way she'd argue with him about modern art, her terrible, wonderful pancakes. Amara listened, and in turn, shared stories of her mother. The late-night shifts, the way she could silence a rowdy room with just a look, her dream of opening a community center that never materialized. "I think that's what I want to do," Amara said one day, staring out at the park. "A place for kids like Theo. And for parents who feel like they're drowning. A place that teaches this just being with it." "We'll do it," Richard said, the "we" slipping out naturally, unplanned. Amara glanced at him, a question in her eyes, but didn't challenge it. The outside world, however, hadn't disappeared. Richard's circle noticed the change. At a charity gala, a business associate clapped him on the back. "Heard you hired a miracle worker for the little one. Good move. Can't have you distracted. The comment reduced Amara's profound impact to a strategic HR decision. Richard simply nodded, a cold smile on his face, but said nothing. Defending her felt strangely personal, a territory he wasn't ready to navigate. For Amara, the outside world was her old life. Her roommate marveled at her new salary but warned about getting lost in that gilded bubble. Her classmates dropped hints about internships at corporate firms. She felt straddled between two planets, belonging fully to neither. The tension between these worlds crystallized one afternoon. Richard's sister, Olivia, a woman of sharp edges and sharper opinions, made an unannounced visit. She took in the scene, Amara on the floor laughing as Theo toddled into her arms, Richard watching from the sofa, his tie loosened, a soft smile on his face he rarely wore. After Amara took Theo to the park with the discreet bodyguard Richard insisted on, Olivia turned to her brother. She's good with him, I'll give her that. But Richard, be careful. People will talk. The help living in the penthouse, it's messy. Richard felt a flare of old anger, the kind he used to wield in boardrooms. She's not the help, Olivia. She's the reason your nephew is learning to laugh again. I'm just looking out for you, Olivia said, her tone implying he was being naive. These situations get complicated. Emotions get blurred. Her words hung in the air after she left, poison in the otherwise clear atmosphere. These situations. Blurred emotions. Was that what this was? A situation? He looked around the room, at Theo's toys mingling with art worth millions. The lines were blurred, between employer and employee, between gratitude and something else, between a paid role and a family's fragile healing. That night, after Amara had retired to her suite, Richard stood in the dark living room. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of Theo's laughter, the ghost of Amara's calm, and the unsettling, undeniable truth that the young woman from the restaurant hadn't just saved his son that night. She had, without permission or pretense, begun to save him too. And he had no idea what to do with that, or where the clear, safe boundaries had gone. The clarity Richard had always relied on, in deals, in strategies, in life, was gone, replaced by a quiet, internal hum of confusion. His sister Olivia's words, "These situations get complicated," played on a loop in his mind. He found himself overanalyzing the simplest interactions. Passing Amara a cup of coffee, their fingers not touching. The way her laughter from the nursery made him pause outside the door, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. The easy silence that now existed between them, which felt more intimate than any business negotiation. He responded by retreating into what he knew, work. He took calls during Theo's playtime, scheduled late meetings, buried himself in spreadsheets. It was a familiar escape, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a self-imposed exile from the only peace he'd known in months. Amara noticed the shift. The man who had been tentatively learning to sit on the floor was now always behind a desk or on a conference call. She didn't comment. She understood walls. She had built her own long ago. But she saw the effect on Theo, who would crawl to his father's closed study door and pat it with a confused little hand. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. A popular celebrity gossip site, always hungry for a billionaire bachelor story, ran a blurry, long-lens photo. It showed Richard, Amara, and Theo in the park. The headline read, "Sterling Secret. Tech Titan's new nanny spends quality time in the park." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, using quotes like "close source" to suggest the arrangement was unconventional and raising eyebrows. It highlighted their difference in age, background, and race with a sleazy, suggestive glee. Richard saw it first. A link texted by a concerned board member. Fury, cold and precise, washed over him. Not for himself, he was used to the spotlight's distortion, but for Amara. She had entered his life as an act of grace and was being reduced to a tabloid trope. He found her in the kitchen, helping Theo drink from a sippy cup. She hadn't seen it. He placed his phone on the counter, the article open. "I need you to see this before you hear about it from somewhere else," he said, his voice tight. "And I am so sorry." Amara read it. Her expression didn't change, but a familiar, weary stiffness settled in her shoulders. It was the same stiffness she'd had after the customer's diversity hire comment. It was the armor she wore when the world insisted on seeing her as a caricature. I should have anticipated this, Richard said, running a hand through his hair. My PR team will issue a statement. We'll sue for invasion of privacy. Amara put the sippy cup down and wiped Theo's mouth. A statement saying what? She asked, her tone dangerously calm. That I'm just the hired help. That there's nothing to see here. That will just make it true. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flash of anger in her eyes. This isn't about you protecting your reputation, Richard. This is about them seeing a black woman in your space and deciding the story for themselves. My story. My dignity. Her use of his first name, sharp and unadorned, cut through his CEO protocol. Then what do you want to do? He asked, genuinely asking, not dictating. I want to go home, she said simply. To Brooklyn. For a few days. Theo and I. It was a test. He knew it. Was his trust in her absolute, or was it conditional on his control? Was she an employee to be managed, or was she the center of his son's world, entitled to her own life? He nodded once. Okay. I'll have security drive you. Discreetly. No, she said. We'll take the subway. Like normal people. The 2 days they were gone were the longest of Richard's life. The penthouse regressed into its tomb-like silence. He fired his PR head for drafting a statement that called Amara a valued domestic employee. He ignored calls from Olivia. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that he wasn't just worried about Theo. He missed her. The quiet certainty of her presence. The way she saw through his facades without even trying. In Brooklyn, Amara breathed. She took Theo to the corner store, let her roommates fuss over him, walked him in his stroller past familiar graffiti and laughing children. She was just a girl from the block with a baby, invisible in the best way. It grounded her. It reminded her who she was beneath the crystal chandeliers. On the second night, as she put Theo to sleep in a makeshift crib, her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. No words. Just a photo. It was a picture he'd taken weeks ago, one she never knew existed. It showed her from behind, sitting on the floor, her head tilted as she read a book to Theo, who was gazing up at her with rapt attention. The afternoon light was pouring in, framing them in gold. The caption read, "This is the only story." Tears, hot and sudden, filled her eyes. It wasn't an apology in words. It was a revelation in an image. He saw them. Not a scandal, not a situation. He saw the truth she built every day. They returned on the third morning. Richard opened the door himself. He looked exhausted. Theo immediately reached for him, and Richard hugged him fiercely, closing his eyes. Over Theo's shoulder, his eyes met Amara's. "Welcome home," he said, the words heavy with meaning. Later, he found her on the terrace. "I was wrong to hide," he stated. "I was trying to draw a line to protect you, but I was just protecting my own comfort. I won't do that again." "The line was always going to be there, Richard," she said, leaning on the railing. "The world draws it in permanent ink. We don't have to live on opposite sides of it." He moved to stand beside her, not too close. "The center you talked about, for kids and parents. Let's not just talk about it. Let's build it. You design it. I'll fund it. We'll call it Elena's Haven." It was the first time he'd said his wife's name to her without grief stifling it. It was spoken with purpose. Amara turned to him, the city wind pulling at her ponytail. In his offer, she didn't see charity or a billionaire's guilt project. She saw a partnership. He was offering her a legacy, not a salary. He was seeing her dream and choosing to stand behind it, not in front of it. "Okay," she said, a real, unguarded smile breaking through. "Let's build it." It was the moment the last wall came down. Not with a declaration of love, but with a covenant of mutual respect. They were no longer a billionaire and a nanny, nor a man and a woman trapped in a complicated situation. They were Richard and Amara, allies standing on a new, uncharted territory they had decided, against all odds and gossip, to map together. The external noise hadn't stopped, but inside the penthouse, they had finally found their own frequency. The decision to build Elena's haven acted like a magnet, pulling their scattered pieces into a coherent, forward-moving shape. What had been a quiet, private understanding in the penthouse now had a blueprint. Richard's drive, once solely focused on corporate conquest, found a new, profound purpose. Amara's academic knowledge and innate empathy were no longer just theory or personal practice, they were the foundational pillars of a real-world sanctuary. They began in the living room that had once felt so empty, now strewn with architectural plans and psychology textbooks instead of toys. Amara spoke of sensory rooms for overwhelmed children, of quiet nooks shaped like warm cocoons, of group therapy spaces that felt like living rooms, not clinics. Richard, with a laser focus she'd only seen him use on merger documents, asked the right questions. What materials soothe instead of stimulate? How do we ensure accessibility not just physically, but emotionally? He listened, truly listened, and then wielded his influence to make it happen, acquiring a donated brownstone in a centrally located, residential neighborhood within a week. Their partnership became a daily dance. Mornings were for Theo, his giggles, his meals, his milestones. Afternoons, once Theo napped, were for the haven. Amara would explain the developmental science behind a mirrored, soundproof panel. Richard would calculate the cost and source the contractor. She talked about creating a grief library with stories for all ages. He contacted publishers and authors for donations. They were building something tangible from their shared, intangible pain. One evening, reviewing a flooring sample that was both soft and easy to clean, Richard looked up at her. "You were right, you know. That first night. You said kids just need to know someone won't leave when it gets loud." He paused, the sample forgotten in his hand. "I think, adults need that too." Amara met his gaze, the air between them shifting. The unspoken thing they had carefully navigated around was now in the room, named by his quiet confession. "Yes," she said simply. "They do." It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music swelled. Theo babbled in his playpen nearby. But it was the final, quiet click of a lock opening. The line between gratitude and something deeper, between partnership and love, had not just blurred, it had dissolved. They didn't rush toward it. They simply stopped pretending it wasn't there. The change was in the details. The coffee he poured for her in the morning, already with a splash of oat milk, just how she liked it. The way she'd straighten his tie absently as they brainstormed, a gesture both domestic and intimate. The comfortable silences that now held a current of shared contentment. They started having dinner together, not as employer and employee, but as a unit. Richard, Amara, and Theo in his high chair, a small, complete universe of three. The outside world continued to buzz. The tabloids lost interest when no more scandal materialized, pivoting to the next story. Olivia, seeing her brother's transformed steadiness and Theo's radiant happiness, reluctantly let her suspicions fade. The real challenge came from Amara's world. Her best friend, Kiana, voiced it over lunch in Brooklyn. "Alma, this is a fairy tale. But fairy tales end. What happens when the project is built, or Theo grows up? You're in his world. Make sure you're not just a chapter in it." Amara considered this. She looked at her hands, which could calm a grieving baby and sketch a community center's floor plan. "I'm not in his world, Keeks," she said finally. "We're building a new one. Together. And I have a key. Not just to his house. To the vision." The truth of that statement was proven on the day of the Haven's soft opening. It was a modest event, for the few social workers and child psychologists who had consulted on the project. Amara stood at the front of the sun-drenched common room, no longer in a waitress's apron or a nanny's casual clothes, but in a simple, elegant dress. She spoke not as an employee, but as the director of programming, her voice clear and assured as she outlined their mission. Richard stood at the back, holding Theo, who was squirming to get down. He didn't hear the statistics she cited or the therapeutic models she described. He watched the young woman who had stepped out from behind a velvet curtain and into his shattered life, now commanding a room with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with him or his money. His heart swelled with a pride so fierce it stole his breath. This was her stage, built with his support, but illuminated by her own light. After the last guest left, they were alone in the peaceful space. Theo tottered happily between the padded play structures. "You were magnificent," Richard said, his voice thick. "It's just the beginning," she replied, but she was smiling, a full, radiant smile he realized he'd been waiting to see. He took a step closer, then another, until they were facing each other. The years of grief, the walls of status and race, the noise of the world, it all fell away in the quiet of the haven they had built. "Amara," he started, then stopped, the man of endless words failing. She didn't make him finish. She reached up and placed a gentle hand on his cheek, her thumb brushing the line of tiredness that was finally easing. It was an answer, a permission, a beginning all in one. He leaned down, and their lips met. It was not a desperate kiss born of passion, but a slow, sure seal on a promise already made. A promise of partnership, of shared breath, of a love that had grown patiently in the fertile ground of shared healing. Theo, seeing his two favorite people close together, giggled and wrapped his arms around both their legs, a joyful anchor. The story that began with a cry in a silent restaurant did not end with a grand wedding or a sweeping declaration. It ended here, in a room built for healing, with a man, a woman, and a child who had found their way back to life not through wealth or power, but through grace. They had not just built a haven for others, they had finally, fully, built a home for themselves. Richard Sterling, the billionaire, had learned that the most valuable things, a child's trust, a partner's respect, a moment of peace, could not be acquired, only earned. And Amara Johnson, the waitress who walked with dignity, had shown that sometimes, the quietest strength is the one that rebuilds entire worlds, one steady breath, one act of kindness, one shared dream at a time. Their story was a testament to a simple, profound truth: the most powerful force in any universe is not the noise of judgment or the weight of gold, but the relentless, quiet courage of the human heart to heal, to hope, and to choose love, against all odds.